try this one time. That feels pretty authoritative. Okay, let's get started here. Well, first ask for any public comment. Seeing none of the public, I think we can move on to approval of the last minutes, which was, of course, a while ago. Can I entertain a motion to accept the minutes? Somebody help me out here.
So moved. I wasn't here, but.
Then I'll second it.
Okay, fine. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so passed. All righty. So we move on to the update of the status, the transportation expenditure plan, and is that you, Brett?
Yes, it
Okay.
is. Brett. I just
Great.
wanted to update the committee about the proposed transportation expenditure plan that is proposed to be on the ballot in November. It would increase the sales tax in Contra Costa County by 0.5% to fund the projects and programs in the proposed transportation expenditure plan. And in your packet, there is the proposed transportation expenditure plan. And there are a couple of things in the TEP, as we're calling it. It's kind of an ugly thing to say, but it does stand for Transportation Expenditure Plan. And there are two programs and one policy that I'd like to point out. On page 13, it's 4-15 in the formal agenda packet. There's a program called Pedestrian, Bicycle, and Trail Facilities. It may look familiar because it's very similar, not identical, but very similar to the Measure J Pedestrian, Bicycle, and Trail Facilities program. It's similar in that it gives 2/3 of the funds for a competitive program and 1/3 of the funds going to the East Bay Regional Park District for the development and rehabilitation of paved regional trails. And that is similar. What's different are two things. One, instead of 1.5% of the revenues from the measure, it would be 4%. So it's a significant increase in funding, not merely a doubling if it kept the same percentage. The other difference is that there are some changes in the wording on the purpose, but the major one is that all projects will be selected through a competitive project selection process within each subregion, with the authority approving the final program of projects. The review shall consider project feasibility and readiness and the differing needs of the subregions when identifying projects for funding. So instead of the funding applications going through this committee, they would be going through the Regional Transportation committees. There are 4 of them. This committee would still have a role in that it is the committee that puts together the Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian plan. And in that plan, there are a number of projects that are identified and priorities and criteria for selecting projects. There's still a requirement in the Pedestrian, Bicycle, and Trail Facilities program, the new one in Measure whatever, we don't know the number yet, that the funds, the 2/3 of the funds shall be used to implement projects in the county bicycle and pedestrian plan consistent with the current Measure J program. So this committee will have a say in setting up what kinds of projects, what kind of priorities, what kind of criteria would be used in selecting projects that through the RTPCs. It's not clear how much funding would go to each of the regions because it's not spelled out exactly how that would occur. The other project that I'd like to mention is the preceding one, Major Streets, Complete Streets, and Traffic Synchronization Project Grants. And that is meant to fund improvements to major thoroughfares to improve the safe, efficient, reliable movement of buses, vehicles, bicyclists, and pedestrians along those corridors, which the measure calls, or the TEP calls, traffic smoothing. And each of the projects shall include a variety of components that meet the needs of all users and respond to the context of the facility. So it's meant to be a program that funds a variety of projects that try to accommodate the needs of every user that would use that facility, and that's the reference to the context of the facility. And that's a significant amount of money. I can't remember the percentage now, but we're estimating it being about $290 million. 20% of that will go to 4 projects, one in each of the 4 subregions, that are meant to be complete streets projects and are meant to demonstrate how a major thoroughfare could become a complete street. And each of those projects will be chosen by the RTPC. And they're meant to be done no later than April 1st, 2022. So that's another almost 6 years from now. So those are the 2 funding categories that I wanted to mention. There's also a new complete streets policy proposed in the TEP. And it's similar to, not identical with, the the MTC complete streets policy. And I'd just like to point out a couple of things. It's on page 21 of the TEP, or 4-23 in your packet. The authority shall revise its development guidelines to require the consideration and accommodation of all users in the design and construction of projects funded with measure funds, and shall adopt peer review and design standards to implement that approach. And as we'll see later when we talk about the scope of work for the update of the Countywide Bike Ped Plan, there is a task that addresses that. So that's one thing that the authority has to update its project development guidelines. The second thing in the next project is paragraph, is that the authority has to prepare a checklist that sponsors of projects using the funds have to submit to the authority that documents how the needs of all users were considered and how they were accommodated in the design and construction of the project. MTC already requires sponsors to do that for federal projects, federally funded projects that go through MTC. And this would be one that would apply to measured projects as well. And that goes down, and it's described further in that paragraph. And at the very bottom of that page is another paragraph that says, as part of their biennial growth management program checklist, agencies shall list projects funded by the measure and detail how those projects accommodated users of all modes. So that's another new requirement that's not currently in the Measure J growth management checklist. So those are the big differences that affect bicycling and pedestrian and active transportation that would occur if the measure is passed in November by the voters. It's a tall order. It's 2/3 plus 1 voters have to approve the measure. So I'll try to answer any questions if you have any about it.
Just 1 second. One thing I failed to do was have people introduce themselves. So belated introductions would be in order. Should we start around this way from you?
Jeremy Locurco, City of Walnut Creek, and TransPAC rep.
Sean Dugan, East Bay Regional Park District.
Paul Reinders, City of Pittsburgh, representing Transplan.
Olson. Sorry, Ole Olson. I think I'm representing Transplant, but maybe, yeah, okay, Brad corrected me. I'm representing Transplant.
I'm
And
Bill Pinkham. Sorry.
I rode my bicycle to this meeting from Pittsburgh, 17.05 miles.
Whoa. Great. This man will live to about 110 or something. I'm Bill Pinkham, West County rep, and Bike East Bay and the Richmond Bike Ped Advisory Committee.
Jerry Fay, County Alternate.
Cynthia Armour, Advocacy Manager with Bike East Bay.
James Hinkamp, City of Lafayette, SWAT Representative.
Joanna Pollack, WICTAC, Staff Representative.
Thanks very much, people. And now we'll entertain questions for Brad.
When does this go to the cities and the RTPCs?
It's gone to the cities. The authority went to the RTPCs quite a while ago, over the last over the last year. And during the last 2 months, they've gone to each of the city councils, and each of the city councils approved the TEP unanimously. There were a couple of abstentions at the meetings, but of the people voting, all the votes were unanimous.
So all the cities adopted it and all the RTPCs. Great.
Can you tell me a little bit about where we stand on the polling for approval of this measure?
I can tell you a little bit about it. Since I was sick when the meeting was being held on the 20th when they presented, but what I do know is that the last poll that was done, which was done in the last month, the polling suggested that of likely voters, there would be that 65% of them would vote for the measure with a 3% plus or minus margin of error. So it's really close. It could be 68. It could be 62. So we don't know. It's close.
I have a quick question. When these are all very general terms, when the cities as the cities develop their complete streets plan, I think Bike East Bay especially, and others, just bike riders, would like to see the inclusion of protected bikeways as a bit of a priority these days. Encourages many more riders, and usually is not part of the complete streets. That usually means bike lanes or even class 3 stuff. So just kind of put that in the back of your mind and make a little check mark, and when you talk to people about that. I'd appreciate it if you brought it up.
I will think, I'm going to guess this is going to be a topic that we discuss as part of the development of the update of the bike ped plan. It is a new technique, a new design that even though Caltrans has endorsed the NACTO design guidelines, including their urban bicycle design guideline, there's still a lot of questions about where you can put them and how they work and how you deal with intersections and all of those design concerns that not every jurisdiction is comfortable with yet, and how you apply them in a lot of different conditions. There are a lot of problematic intersections in Contra Costa, and how you incorporate protected bike lanes into them, especially in constricted rights of way, is going to be an issue.
There have already been some installed or about to be installed on major thoroughfares, which I think is something to push for early. Telegraph Avenue in Oakland, Berkeley, and City of El Cerrito has voted for protected bike lanes on San Pablo Avenue. So wouldn't that be fantastic if you could ride San Pablo Avenue from Oakland to San Pablo, something like that. Anyway.
I have another question. So I know tons of effort went into when forming this TEP to define what a quality complete streets project is and what is a bike lane. Is it my understanding that we will be forming this project development guideline or this checklist as part of this committee? Is that what you mentioned earlier?
Well, it is. We'll discuss this in the next item or the item after. No, it's the one after lunch when we discuss the update of the bike ped plan. But the request for proposals did include in its proposed scope of work that the consultant would review the authority's development procedures guidelines to see how we can incorporate complete streets ideas and consideration of active transportation as part of those guidelines. So that is something that this committee will be discussing. I'm guessing it would be a policy in the plan ultimately, plus some recommendations on how the guidelines can be updated. I know that staff here is interested in looking into that update since it's definitely part of the proposed TEP.
I have a question regarding the 20% in the major streets and roads pot of funding. So you mentioned that the 4 different projects, we're not sure yet exactly how they will be chosen, but it will probably be through the RTPCs. Can you expand a little bit on that or what the criteria might be or how it might go up the different ladders before actually becoming an established project that gets the funding?
Well, there's not much in the way of other than what's in the proposed TEP itself, and that says projects will be required to strongly pursue the use of separated bike lane facilities in the demonstration project program, which is protected bike lanes or similar facility. If you look at the NACTO guidelines, there are a number of different ways that you can incorporate protected bike lanes. Are they contraflow? Or on one side of the street, both sides of the street? There are a lot of questions, but the idea is that those potential alternatives would be strongly considered in each of those demonstration projects. And the purpose, as the TEP notes, is that these demonstration projects create examples of how jurisdictions could successfully create a complete street within the different contexts in Contra Costa County. So they're meant to be different approaches that different approaches that could apply in different situations. Some newer communities, like Brentwood, for example, or some older communities like around here in Concord or in Richmond, both of which were developed roughly the same time. Richmond's a little bit older, though Concord's actually a very old city. Martinez is the oldest incorporated jurisdiction in Contra Costa.
Are there other questions on this topic? I received a bit of a belated speaker card. If there's no objection, I'll let, as a public speaker, I will let that person speak. Any objections to that? Would you kind of step up the mic, please? Is Jody Linden, or what is that? Linden.
Hi, my name is Jody London. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm the new Sustainability Coordinator for Contra Costa County, In December, the Board of Supervisors adopted a climate action plan. They also last year approved the creation of this position to oversee implementation of the climate action plan. As you all are aware, transportation emissions are a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions in our county, so I'm extremely interested in what you're doing, and I know it's not within your bailiwick, but I could not find parking for my electric vehicle. When I pulled into the parking lot, there was only a reserve spot left. So CCTA, are you the staff person? Might want to think about seeing if you can get another charger over there. Anyway, I'm very excited to work with all of you, particularly those of you who work for the cities. I'd love to get your information so I can connect up with you and the rest of you as well. I'd just love to connect with everybody. You know, I'm finding my way. This is a new position for the county, a new climate action plan. I know Jerry, but I don't know the rest of you. So I look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Do you intend to come to our meetings on a regular basis, or?
I do, but I think I have to go buy my own lunch.
Well,
We'll share.
we'll
Do
work
you
on
have
that one.
business cards that maybe you can leave? And Brad can probably, because we have one component that I think that's more relevant, not more relevant, as relevant is the TDM component. And I don't know if you've been working with 511 Contra Costa. But
I started June 1st, so I have not yet, but I would love to. That's why I'm here. I wanted to make sure you know I'm here and get, you know.
if you could leave some business cards, that'd be
definitely.
great. Because I think all the RTPCs have relevant staff.
Cool. Great.
I'd like to add to your parking problem that Ole biked 17 miles to come to this meeting, and he had to park along the railing of the stairs here because there is no bike parking in front of this building.
I will say there is a secret bike rack in the parking garage. It is covered, but it's at the bottom, not at the absolute bottom, but it's near the bottom where the elevators are. We have been promised that there would be bike racks out front, but they have not yet appeared.
Take a page off the new building that houses the MTC, ABAG, and Bachmud, which has indoor bike parking on the second floor. But that's what we really would like. Sorry about that. Okay. Any other comments? Okay, then let us move on to the next item, call for projects.
We have been working, I won't say assiduously, but over the last several months with a working group, at least one member of which is here, to come up with a coordinated call for projects for it's cycle 3 of federal funding, but it's the second round of One Bay Area Grant, or OBAG funding. So we're calling it OBAG 2. That is federal funding that comes to the county through MTC. There is also a call for project that will go at the same time for the Measure J Transportation for Livable Communities, or TLC program, and for the Pedestrian, Bicycle, and Trail Facilities program. And that latter one will come through this committee. And previously, you've come up with criteria, made some revisions to the criteria that we used last time, and also changed the weighting a bit. So what I've done is put together an estimate of the funding that's going to be available, and that's on the second page of the agenda item 5. We're assuming that we're going to get about $10,760,000 through fiscal year 2022 for the program, and that includes the 1.5%. Plus the 0.04% that goes specifically to West County. Now, there are also some savings from the prior cycle. There's about $332,000 for the competitive portion and $116,000 for East Bay Regional Park District. So that turns out to be about 7.6 for the competitive program and 3.6 for the East Bay Regional Park District share. And that comes out to a total of $11.2 million that is going to be allocated through this call for projects. I've updated the program guidelines based on our previous discussions. There's a few changes. Under eligible project phases on page 5-4, it's the second page of the proposed guidelines. I've added a sentence under that. It originally said PBTF funds may be used to fund all phases of a project, including design, right-of-way, and construction. And then I added the sentence, as noted above, however, the countywide share of PBTF program must be used to complete projects in the CBPAC and therefore must result in the completion of a usable bicycle and pedestrian project. That's one thing that Measure J says, that these are meant to, projects are meant to complete a project. So you can use funds to design the project and buy right-of-way for the project and do the environmental clearance and project approval, but you have to also do the construction and complete the project. That was a little bit unclear in the first call for project. There's some editing that I did under ineligible projects just for clarity. On the fourth page of the draft guidelines, 5.6, 5-6 in the packet, the middle of the page, there's also just a clarifying edit. We didn't include the outline for the funding applications since it's going to be a combined application with all three of the programs, OBAG 2, TLC, and PBTF. And then at the very end is Exhibit A, which is the criteria for project selection that you discussed and approved in November. So what I'm looking for is just your recommendation that we incorporate these criteria and the guidelines as part of the call for projects.
I have a question before we do so. Part of the eligible projects criteria, the project needs to be within the countywide bicycle and pedestrian plan. Has there been any conversation about projects that are in a local plan still being eligible for funding? Since the countywide plan is from 2009, I'm just wondering if there's any flexibility that was discussed.
Well, that would be up to, I mean, that's an issue for the committee to discuss. The way we've dealt with it before in the guidelines is, let me see where it is. There are three categories, not three categories specifically, projects specifically listed in the Appendix E, which is the listing of projects. And you're right, it's not completely current, though we do have something called a Comprehensive Transportation Project List, which has been updated since 2009 and which was used to create Appendix E. So one thing we could do is to recommend that we use that we update Appendix E using the countywide, the Comprehensive Transportation Project List, and use that to define eligibility. There may be some projects that I think the most recent bike ped plan was Concord's.
It's not adopted yet, but it will be adopted in September. Sorry. The Concord plan is not adopted yet, but it will be adopted in September.
Questions, comments?
I have a question. You mentioned the new criteria. Can we go back to that? That you added that said we actually have to, project applicants have to, the money can be used for design, planning, et cetera, but it has to go towards completing the project. I'm a little confused because that is the idea, right, when projects are moving forward, but is this an attempt to make it so that projects don't just get put on a shelf? Is it?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
We did fund a project last time that was I think it's actually a PID, a project initiation document. So the project has not been, the PID's done, but the project isn't. And probably shouldn't have been approved, but it was.
Okay, so how would applicants, how do you envision that process going? So that has to be completed within a certain amount of time after the money's been provided for the project, or?
We're much more flexible than Caltrans is at setting deadlines. We do still have some projects hanging around that have not been completed yet from the 2012 programming plan, and that I think the bike ped, the PBTF projects have done a better job at being completed than some of the TLC ones. But yes, we still have some projects that should have been completed in fiscal year 15 that are not done yet.
Okay, thanks. Of course, I'm in the weeds a little bit, but I was trying to picture how that would play out and what sort of criteria would be added on top of that for project applicants that may promise a project to be completed, but you never know, what happened. But okay, I think I'm in support of the addition. I just want to see how it play out. So thanks.
Other comments, questions?
I would be comfortable accepting city plans that have been ratified since we ratified the countywide plan, the project lists from that. Kind of a de facto, a sneak in the back door update of the countywide plan before we update the countywide plan. Did that make any sense?
I understood it.
Okay, thank you. You're the important guy.
Well, but it would be good to have this committee include that as part of your recommendation.
Well, we could include something along the lines of, if I pull it up, so the current language is the countywide share of PBTF funds may be used to fund the design and construction of facilities that support and encourage walking or bicycling, and that identified in the countywide bicycle and pedestrian plan. So we should add "are" in that sentence, and then so that it says "and that are identified in the countywide bicycle and pedestrian plan," or a later adopted local plan. I mean, if you wanted, you could even include something along the lines of, as long as it is consistent with the county's complete streets policy.
Yes, we want to encourage updating of local bike ped plans, which should really happen every 5 years. Doesn't always, or maybe even that often, but we should be encouraging it.
Yeah, honored in the breach, I guess. I can come up with some wording that's basically what you said. And you are being taped and broadcast, so I will seriously.
Brad, rather than have it specifically identified or referenced in a local bike plan, which I think in those cases can even be up to 5 years old, I would rather the language be a little bit more broad to suggest that a local adopted plan, because we have a lot of jurisdictions have specific plans that may have more readily identified bike ped improvements than, say, a local bike plan that was maybe updated 5+ years ago. So I would think that as long as it's a bicycle or pedestrian improvement that has been identified and has been adopted in a planning document, whether it's a specific bike plan or it's a specific plan. And let me give you a good example of that. The county is working, as you probably know, right outside here on a plan for Treat 680 corridor, which was to come up with improvement bike and ped access across the overcrossing here between the Pleasant Hill BART station and North Main Street. Well, that's a great plan, but that plan hasn't been incorporated yet into any of the local bicycle plans. Similarly, we have the Olympic Corridor study, which was recently completed with TLC grant funding, and that was a corridor study that looked at linking the Lafayette-Moraga Trail with the Iron Horse Trail through downtown Walnut Creek. Here again, there's no specific recommendations in the local bike plan that reference those improvements, but it was a plan that had been funded through Measure J and does propose some very specific recommendations. So I would recommend that the language be somewhat flexible, that allows, as long as it's referenced in a plan, then it would be something that could be eligible for the funding.
So sort of to combine the two ideas, it has to be in the 2009 plan or in a plan locally adopted since 2009 that identifies a project. And in the local adoption and the since 2009 are two of the key components.
Yes, and consistent with the Complete Streets policy.
Well, the Complete Streets policy isn't adopted either yet, so but perhaps something consistent with the policies of the bike ped plan, which are fairly broad.
On the discussion of the Complete Streets policy, every city in the county has said yes about it, plus the county has said yes about it, plus the RTCPs have said yes about it. If that sounds pretty adopted to me, just the voters haven't said yes about it.
That's true. It's true. But it's not enforced yet, and that's, I guess,
we can enforce it by including it in this statement.
I appreciate the support, but the people's vote is important too.
Point well taken, at least to get the money. Who said that?
Anyone else?
I'll just say, I'll add, I'd like to see the language that you come up with, and then that will come forward at our next meeting for adoption. Is that?
Well, we were going to bring the proposed call for projects to the authority in September, and you're scheduled to meet in September, but after the authority meeting. The authority meets, I can't remember the date. You're scheduled to meet, I think, on the 26th of September, which actually we're going to have to change. I forgot that because I'm not going to be here. I will be in Seattle at the Designing Cities Conference, which NACTO is sponsoring.
So we need to decide today? Is that what I'm hearing?
That was my implication,
okay.
Yes. Thank you for eliciting and drawing that out of my indirect statement.
So should we just pull from the current Complete Streets policy or the MTC Complete Streets policy? Or from the proposed Complete Streets policy in the upcoming TEP?
Well, I'll throw it back to the committee on which.
I like the one from the TEP. Every city in the county, plus the RTCPs have said, yes, that's a good sounding policy. Mm-hmm. And we're inviting the citizens of the county to vote yes on it also. But our polling indicates that at least approximately 65% of the people have already indicated that they are in favor of the TEP. Those are good numbers from my perspective.
I think I'll second that.
The one thing I'll say about it, though, is that what is it about the Complete Streets policy that, let me step back. That's not quite the way I want to put it. The Complete Streets policy has a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily relate to selecting the project, and some of it is about the authority creating a new question on the growth management checklist and a new set of procedures. Those are things that wouldn't necessarily apply to a project that's applying for funding through the PBTF. The only policy, one of the main policy that would have, I think, affected would be that policy, it's the first paragraph, the first and maybe the second paragraph in the, it's actually just the first one. To achieve this vision, all recipients of funding through this plan shall consider and accommodate wherever possible and subject to the exceptions, the needs of all users. I mean, that is, that statement with a few tweaks is what most of the jurisdictions have already adopted when they adopted the MTC Complete Streets resolution. So in terms of including the exceptions, which were also in that resolution, maybe I'm talking myself out of my opposition.
I was just going to say, the specific reference to Complete Streets, I think it's good to have in here in terms of criteria. We may want to reference it as in terms of the evaluation or the criteria itself, where we're talking about, range and number of users. There's any number of ways that you can figure a complete street in here. Obviously, if you're proposing to build a Class 1 facility, it's not a complete street. It's a separate bicycle facility that has nothing to do with the other kind of a complete street also implies transit, vehicular accommodation as well. And so there may be by default when we're talking about all of the criteria that we have in here. We talk about transit ridership. We talk about countywide or regional significance, improved connectivity, and range and number of users. I don't know if there's a way we can add, to what extent the project will complete a street or will provide expanded access. We already talk about safety, so I'm just kind of wondering if it's kind of already in here to some degree, if maybe there's a way to reference it so that way it's more specifically implied without actually referring to the actual policy that cities have adopted, which are really based on an MTC guideline, not on a Measure J guideline.
I like the concept of saying the words complete streets in here. I'm thinking specifically of California Avenue in Pittsburgh, which is right next to the new E-BART station, right across the street from the new Kiss and Ride, and it's a constrained street, and I want to add bike lanes to it, and we're going to have to take away a traffic lane. So I want all the ammunition I can have.
Is there a way that we can just say it conforms to the current complete streets guidelines in place at the time, or, rather than project? I like the complete streets in the TEP as well. A lot of effort went into writing that, but if it doesn't get adopted, then we'll be reverting to the existing policy, or if it doesn't get passed in November. So, is that a way around?
It seems like there's a consensus that to be eligible, you have to be in the plan now or in a locally adopted plan, adopted since 2009. The question, and it doesn't have to be a bike ped plan or a bike plan or a ped plan or a complete streets plan or a trails plan. Could be a specific plan as well. And I'm guessing there's a consensus for that, and the question is whether there's an additional requirement that the sponsor or the jurisdiction, when it adopted the plan, considered the needs of all users and tried to accommodate those users in the development of the projects in those plans, which is the idea behind complete streets. Without saying complete streets. Or you could just say that the sponsor considered complete streets, I don't want to say ideas, but that try to incorporate complete streets as within the planning.
I think you just kind of hit one of the points that I was making is just because you have an adopted policy, the only thing that the adopted policy basically requires is that a jurisdiction consider all users when they're building out a facility. It doesn't necessarily say that a city has to accommodate because obviously there's other considerations. And I think even the MTC policy requires that if there is an exception, there needs to be, to a complete street improvement, there needs to be findings made by some, lead engineer. But I think I don't want to speak for the committee, it seems to me like the idea, the goal is to end up completing streets, is to be able to build out the facilities, not necessarily say that it's compliant with a policy, and in the policy there's exceptions to actually building out a facility, because technically a jurisdiction can say, well, we're compliant with our complete streets, our resolution, our policy, because, we did consider all modes. It's just unfortunately on this specific roadway we couldn't accommodate all modes. Does that make sense? I don't know, does anybody, I guess that would be my only concern about actually referencing the policy, is that if it's not actually providing the facility, then we're just referencing words.
It does say consider and accommodate wherever possible and subject to the exceptions listed in this policy in the new TEP. Is we referring?
But the exceptions that are listed is more of the issue, is that there are exceptions to being able to accommodate. Yeah.
The main reason I initially brought up the addition of the complete streets policy being added in that paragraph is I think that typically when bike plans and bike and ped plans are crafted and adopted, they really do go towards that goal of building complete streets. But if we're now talking about including any locally adopted plan that might include a project that could be a complete streets project, we just want to make sure that because it is not specifically an active transportation project, it actually does go forward with the sort of project that we want to see funded through this through OBAG. Does that make any sense? It's just because it's a different kind of plan, because it's not necessarily just bike and ped plans, because it might be a downtown specific plan or not an active transportation plan. We want to make sure that it is actually building complete streets. And, yes, I know that all cities have complete streets policies, et cetera, but was that project actually designed with that in mind?
And I understand that. I guess the only concern that I have is that I wonder, when we review, I'm just trying to remember the last time we did the committee was evaluating projects for this last PBTF funding cycle. There wasn't complete streets requirements at that time, but we saw a lot of very good pedestrian and or bike projects. And some of the bike projects that we saw, I remember one specifically that didn't get funded, and it wasn't because it was a poor application. It was Moraga. In Moraga, it was the facility, if it was on Moraga Road or whatever, but they were proposing to add, I think it was a bike facility. There really wasn't any pedestrian accommodation there. And they couldn't because they just didn't have the right of way, or they just kind of fell off into dirt. And so the question here again is that if we require that the facilities be a complete street, does that mean that every project needs to have a bike and ped and transit component to it? Otherwise, it's not considered an eligible project under the funding. Or if there's currently no bike facility and they're adding separated bike facilities, what does that mean if there's no pedestrian component to it? And so, when we're evaluating that, are we able to say that that's a complete street if it's lacking a pedestrian facility? So I guess what I'm saying is we need to be careful on how it's worded, because we don't want to disqualify certain applicants from being able to provide facilities that are very much wanted and very much needed. There may be other kind of considerations like topographic, or there may be physical constraints or right-of-way issues, engineering, whatever, that make it cost prohibitive, that maybe they can't do the whole street to make it a complete street. Maybe all they can do is just add a separated bike facility, or maybe all they can do is add, a sidewalk gap. So I just want to kind of reiterate that I think there needs to be some sort of flexibility. And ultimately, when the applications come back, though, my understanding is it's this committee that will be reviewing the applications and will be recommending those highly scored projects for funding. Is that correct, Brad?
Yes. The applications for PBTF funding will come back to this committee for review. And the Moraga project is part of the reason was that they weren't ready, and part of it was that they didn't include pedestrian facilities. They did get a TLC grant, and they are working on a design that is more of a complete street from Moraga Way. Yes, Moraga Road.
No, we don't want to provide a catch-22 so that jurisdictions can get out of doing a project because it doesn't quite include all the complete streets requirements. So as long as we make that clear, I think that's very important.
And Bill, I remember we went out to each of the sites, and that was, to me, the best part of determining how suitable the project was. Each of the public works or planning directors or whoever was the point person came and talked about their project. It came real to me why something was so expensive, or where something was actually located and fit together or didn't fit together. I think that's like a piece. It's intuitive, but it's not something we can draft into language. I mean, we had a lot of debate, but that was also the visit that made it. Are we going to do that again?
I was resistant the last time, but it was very useful.
I was even resistant, but now I'm not.
And I would like to thank the Park District for providing us the vehicles to get around to see the sites. But I forgot what I was going to say.
We could do that again, by the way.
It was very useful.
I can second what Joanna said. Jerry well knows, and Ole, those of us on the BAC that meets in December and has a list of projects which we look and evaluate for an on-street review and final recommendation. The key part of that is looking at the projects on the ground before we decide, and I highly recommend that we maybe even make it a requirement, but I think it's very important to do that.
Well, stepping back from the idea of adding this new screening criteria or expanding the screening criteria, because that's basically what we're doing. We're saying what projects can apply for this funding if they're listed in the plan, or I get the sense that there's a consensus here, or the project is included in a plan adopted by the sponsor since 2009, since the adoption of the Countywide Bicycle Pedestrian Plan. And the question we're talking about now is if there should be an additional requirement about complete streets. And part of the difficulty will be determining whether they comply with that additional component. So how would I, as a screener, look at a project and say, it's easy to say, it's in this plan that was adopted in 2011, say. It's in the plan, but how do I apply the screening criteria? What's the bright, policy wonks say the bright line test of whether it's complied with a complete streets policy of the jurisdiction or not. That's the question I think that we're having difficulty with.
I agree we're having difficulty with it, and maybe we could say moves in the direction of creating complete streets. If we don't say complete streets, I fear California Avenue is not going to get bike lanes on it because it's not mentioned in any plan.
Well, that in itself would mean it's not eligible.
If we say complete streets?
But not if we say you have to be in a plan adopted locally since 2009, and the bike lane on California is not included in one of those plans. Then just by that fact, it wouldn't be eligible.
Let me ask Paul. Does the Railroad Avenue specific plan call for bike lanes on California Avenue?
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I don't believe it is.
I don't believe it does either. I want bike lanes on California Avenue. Help me. How can we get this? Jeremy, you're a good thinker. Put you on the spot, didn't I?
Don't call me out. I don't work in Pittsburgh. I can't help you there. I think ideally we can reference. I think one of the criteria that will help it score. Will the project help to implement, provide a more complete street or expand or an accommodation? I'm trying to think of the last range, I use Moraga as an example, but there was also a huge number of other projects that were funded that included really only one mode benefit. It really wasn't a, multimodal. I can think of Walnut Creek. We got funding to install crosswalks, some flashing beacons. It was a pedestrian safety improvement. There was nothing in there about bikes, but that's okay. It was a pedestrian safety improvement that was really intended to help that. And I don't recall necessarily that was indicated in a plan, although it was that by its nature was in a pedestrian zone. So I guess that's why it got funded. I don't know if in the same vein, if all projects, whether a jurisdiction wants to add bike lanes, Is that, I guess, from the authority's perspective, is there a problem if it's not in an adopted plan, but yet the subsequent adoption of a local jurisdiction's complete street policy now is requiring them to consider adding this? Like, I'll give you another example. Right down the street, North Main, bike lanes were just added there, but it wasn't in any adopted plan. We didn't have it in our local bike plan. It wasn't identified in the countywide plan, but yet because we adopted a complete street policy and it went through the standard review, and I think it was processed through OBAG, we did end up adding bike lanes. But here again, would this then disqualify? That's just one example, but here's an opportunity where we were doing an overlay. In the process of doing an overlay, we added bike lanes. Would that all of a sudden not become eligible for funding because it wasn't in an adopted plan? It was, however, consistent with our complete streets policy.
Excuse me, we are 5 minutes into the witching hour here, the magic hour of lunch, and I suggest we kick it around a little bit more while we're eating. But right now, let's avail ourselves of the fabulous repast that the county provides us every time. Thank you.
The authority, please. So you were going to take a recess for lunch and then come back and discuss it further? Okay.
Not just me, it's 73 degrees in here.
Come on, June 1st. You can't keep using that.
6 weeks.
7 weeks now.
Oh, Judy? Jody, sorry. Have you done that your whole life? Had to tell people that? Jody, Julie, just don't call me. Yeah, it's very, actually, it's really good. I think in my spare time. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah,
It started in 2009.
Except you. Where did you come from?
2030, so it's 25 years from there. So it's 2034, I'm sorry. Specialties, they have a operation, I wouldn't say store, but there's a specialties cafe up in Tree Towers.
I did. Someone had left the house there.
There's one full vegetarian sandwich left and a half a cookie.
I didn't take you as carnivores, but. No, I didn't.
Well, I'm afraid we ought to get going here, and now that we've talked together and solved all the problems of the language that we have.
Could I make a recommendation and
Sure.
see what you think? And that's that we add a screening criterion that says that the project has to be or can be in a locally adopted plan, adopted since 2009, and that was developed consistent with the sponsor's adopted complete streets policies and requirements. Yes.
People agree with that?
I can live with that.
Okay, that the project is in an adopted plan, a local adopted plan, adopted since 2009, and that was developed consistent with the sponsor's adopted complete streets policies and requirements.
The other way to say it is, a project does not have to be in the CBPAC 2009 version of the plan,
Yes, that is what it would mean.
which I think is almost more straightforward. You could then put a semicolon after that and say, it must be in a locally adopted complete street complying plan or something.
Well, that's in essence what that phrase is trying to get at. The only issue there, two things. One, it would apply to bicycle projects. The pedestrian Well, it could apply to pedestrian. The pedestrian projects have a different criterion, which is that they're in priority locations, downtowns, and other PED districts, pedestrian access to transit stops and stations, and access routes to other activity centers. So pedestrian projects have a somewhat broader screening criterion. The other thing is that not all transit agencies, and I'm thinking particularly of BART, have complete streets requirements that they adopted. MCC doesn't require them to have them. They don't adopt a general plan. So that's the one qualm that I have about my proposed language.
I think we need to call for a motion to accept Brad's scheme, general policy. Solution, pardon me.
I like that better.
One little bit of further discussion on that, and it is, if a jurisdiction wants to add a half mile or a mile of bike lanes to a grind and overlay that they're doing, and it's not on any plan, but they could use a little nudge from us with a little bit of money, not a whole lot, but a little bit, it seems to me we don't want to preclude that little nudge. That's the direction I'm moving in. I could accept Brad's language, and thank you for your concern.
First, we need a motion before we discuss that. Anyone want to make that motion?
Sorry, one question before. Can you just reread it one more time in the context of the entire sentence?
I would see it as between the second and third bullets. And it would be a bicycle project identified in a locally adopted plan, adopted since 2009, and that was developed consistent with the sponsor's adopted complete streets policies and requirements.
So this is in the what projects are in the CBPP bullet list?
Yes.
Well, that doesn't make sense, though.
In what sense does it make?
Because
no sense?
Those projects are not in the CBPP.
Yes, that is true. I mean, we could add a prefatory phrase that says that since Appendix D, local bicycle networks, is based on locally adopted plans and has not been updated since 2009, comma, and then go on. Because it is true that we base Appendix D on locally adopted plans. Basically, it's a compilation of locally adopted plans, which we will update as part of the update of the Countywide Bike Ped Plan.
Still waiting for a motion, and then we can add discussion if we'd like. We've sort of done it the other way, but I think I need a formal motion.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt the guidelines for Measure J PBTF program with Brad's additional criteria.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion, further discussion?
Brad, I had a question or a suggestion. Do we have any ability to change the criteria in the criteria for project selection? And where I'm looking at specifically is the very last criteria, which is local and policy support, where it says project would implement policies and local plans, integrate with other local efforts, and have support from the general public, the RTPCs, and other relevant agencies. I'm wondering if we can add a reference to is consistent with this adopted the local complete street policy, or something like to that effect. So that way they're actually being scored on.
We could. Yes.
I think that would, aside from just referencing it, would also let the jurisdiction know that if they're applying for it, the expectation and the way that they can score actually higher is that if they can demonstrate that they're consistent with a complete street.
Would the maker of the motion accept that?
Is there other discussion?
Yes. Just to be clear, though, that is already a criteria that you have to meet to complete streets. It's just emphasizing that fact.
It's a criteria, but it would specifically point it out as part of project scoring.
Great. I have no problem.
Anyone else?
So now we're going to make Brad redo all the numbers, the weights? No? Just add 5 more?
It would just, under under local and policy support, which is on 5-11, still weighted at 5 points, but it says the project would implement policies and local plans. Maybe we add the word is consistent with local complete streets policies and other local efforts and has the support of the general public, the RTPCs, and other relevant agencies.
So you're adding complete streets. Right.
Is that, satisfied all? Okay. If there's no further discussion, then let's take a vote. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Motion carried. Now we're going to move on to the update of the CBPP. Our approach to that.
Thank you. On May 4th, we released RFP 16-1 to get us a consultant to help update the countywide bicycle pedestrian plan. We got 2 proposals, one from Tool Design Group and the other from Fair and Piers. Got a group of local staff who reviewed the applications and who interviewed the 2 teams. And their recommendation was that Fair and Piers be selected. We had a number of goals and objectives in the RFP, which we discussed earlier. And we have some specific objectives. What I've included in the packet as an attachment is the Fair and Piers Section 6 of their proposal, Project Understanding and Approach. And it covers a lot of the things that were covered in the RFP. It emphasizes a couple of them. It introduces a new acronym, which I had never heard, Across Barriers Connections, ABCs. So that's, Mr. Olson has mentioned that as an issue of trying to make those cross-barrier connections. It's in a lot of ways, it's a pretty standard scope of work, but it does include a couple of points and pieces that I'd like to point out. There's a first task that's project management and meetings. That's pretty common and necessary. The second task is baseline conditions, doing a lot of data collection. They would, as part of that, go out to each of the jurisdictions to understand what their plans are and what their policies are and conditions within their communities. One of the things that they're proposing to use is something called the Bicycle and Pedestrian Safety Assessment Methodology, and to use the Berkeley Transportation Injury Mapping System, or what's known as TIMS. Some jurisdictions have some issues with the TIMS data because of how it's collected, and that it's collected in a particular way. So that may be something we have to talk about. There is an optional task that they're proposing to use to have us buy Strava data. I personally have some issues with Strava data because the users are primarily recreational. If you look at the Strava data, and I have great maps, don't get me wrong, but I will tell you, if you've looked at that, you would think that you mostly want to put bicycle improvements on Mount Diablo. Because there are a lot of trips up Mount Diablo to Strevity. It's not, they do, if you were to discount some of those, you might get a more representative picture of utilitarian bicycle trips. They're proposed to do a state of walking and biking, and Contra Costa is part of that, and inventory of bike facilities, collision analysis, pedestrian barriers, cross barriers connections. They have two optional tasks. One is optional task 2.2.7, which is a level of traffic stress analysis, which is becoming more common. It's based on the Mineta Transportation Institute's method, where you look at number of lanes, speed, volume, and come up with a level of traffic stress analysis. It's been done on a countywide level, not at least back east, not, I think, on a county quite the size of Contra Costa, but it could be useful for identifying those streets that have a fairly high stress for people who are trying to ride or even trying to walk. But that's an optional task that we'd like to think about anyway. Then they also proposed to do local profiles that would go to each of the jurisdictions. They have a public engagement stakeholder outreach program. A lot of it's pretty similar, going out to the jurisdictions, doing a project website, doing pop-up public input stations out at various places like farmers markets or community fairs, parent meetings at local schools, for example. They have a couple of optional ones as well, additional workshops, a telephone town hall or online open house where people can go on and either call up or to go online to view things and then leave their comments. The town hall is something we used as part of the development of the Countywide Transportation Plan and the TEP, and they were very successful. Not cheap, however, but successful. Because you have to, it's not the town hall itself, it's the notification that's so expensive. And then there's also an optional task of customized route choice and user preference smartphone application. Something like cycle tracks that San Francisco developed, where people download the app to your phone, and then before you take a trip, you say, start, take your trip, and then say what your purpose was. And that way you can get a lot of data. The app is free. Getting the data from San Francisco is not free, but it's not very expensive. The difficulty is making sure that the information you get is representative of the broad range of users in the county, which is always a difficult thing. They also have a task on estimating future demand. That's something that some of the committee members were interested in, is having a consistent methodology that we can use throughout the county. Their main scope includes a countywide latent demand heat map, which will visualize where development tells us that walking and bicycling are likely to occur. And they are proposing to put together an Excel-based form to calculate future bicycling and walking demand that local jurisdictions can use to see the impacts or judge and evaluate the impacts of a particular facility they're proposing to improve, whether it's bike lanes, bike route, new sidewalks, etc. They're also proposing an optional task of doing a demand regression model where they take the bike ped index and the forecasting worksheet and then they compare it to actual bicycling counts that we have, the limited number that we have in the county, and to see how well the two match. It is something that we use for the traffic model often. It isn't something we've done for bicycling or pedestrian counts. Then they would do task 5, which is do a strategic white paper saying, here's what we propose to do in updating the countywide bicycle pedestrian plan. And it would recommend an approach to updating the policies and programs, developing a backbone low-stress bike network and primary pedestrian zones in the county, defining performance measures and funding allocation protocols to ensure equity and efficiency. Though I changed that to effectiveness myself, and efficiency is kind of a squishy word. And then prioritizing projects and programs, and then estimating facility usage and project and program costs. And once that's done, they'll prepare a draft, do the environmental review on that, and then finally adopt it. So that's the basic approach that they're taking. I'm going to be working with them, coming up with a scope, and that would be in a contract that would be approved by the authority in September. What I'd like to hear from you, if you have any ideas on some of those components, whether some of them you think are not necessary, some of the optional ones that you think we should consider adding, if there are any particular concerns about how the plan is updated.
Yes, I do. Do they plan to take into consideration existing bike plans, existing LOS, things that are known already, or are they going to suggest that these be redone to accommodate or to address the more current conditions? I don't know. I hate to be inventing the wheel with this because it's a big scope of things.
That is something that some of the members have mentioned before, that jurisdictions have spent a lot of time and effort and public output and input to come up with their plans. And the way it was worded in the RFP and the way they worded in their approach is to harmonize those plans. And as a first step, to do mapping of the planned facilities and to see where there are discontinuities, or I guess discontinuity is probably a good word. That's what we've been trying to do all along, is trying to harmonize and support the local efforts to make walking and bicycling more safe and more attractive. Safer and more attractive.
Just because we're doing a study, not similar, it's focused on senior and disabled, but outreach is really expensive. They're doing $125,000 this project, is that right? I would like to see, outreach is also really difficult these days because it's hard to get people's attention. And they're going to be working, I guess, directly with us. When it was Fair and Pierce before, it was, can't remember her name. No, the Brooke.
Right.
She's now with Tool, as I understand it. So we don't have that continuity, but hopefully when it comes time to do outreach, they don't have a set plan yet, and we will be hopefully able to influence and maybe tie together things to entice the public. I mean, we did not get a good turnout when we went out to do a study and talk to the West County residents about high-capacity transit. It was like, I wouldn't go to that normally. It's not exciting on a Tuesday night. So I'm just thinking how we as cities or RTPCs can make this more effectual and work with them closely. And maybe not put everything down in permanent ink, but let it evolve.
I think practically speaking, they will be talking to local bike ped groups. When we passed the bike ped master plans in Richmond, the city council accepted it unanimously, but they put the rider on that when a major project is coming up or about to be done, you go to the neighborhood council. Now, of course, not every city has neighborhood councils, but some equivalent. You go to them and you tell them what's happening, because I think you're quite right that, Joanna, that a lot of folks are not going to come. They're not going to participate in a webinar or some kind of town hall, and they'll be surprised when some project happens.
That's inevitable.
It's a tough nut, but I think we'll have to deal with it.
And we don't want to just see the same people and the advocates, and that's always the issue. But going to bike trails or going to wherever people are congregating, and whether it's recreational versus commuting and all those things, I just think that this update, if it's going to be robust, has maybe still evolved, where it goes and how it goes. And they can meet with us and we can chat about it and what they want to do. And who's the lead on it?
Megan Mittman. I will say one of the things that they proposed to do, and we actually have found that online input is pretty effective, and we get a lot more people than going out and having open houses at the different parts of the county. You're right, you don't get that many people, maybe get 0.0001% of the population that shows up at the workshops. We got a lot of people at the town halls, and I know that Fair and Piers and Tool Design actually as well have used online input where you have a map and you can, leave a note on the map saying, this is a really bad intersection. Why did they do this? You need to put in a sidewalk from here to here. And that's one way. It's not a one-time open house, though you can do.
Yeah, and the town
like
halls
that.
were great, but I think they were $40,000 each, if I remember. So they were great when you did them for the CTP and for even the TEP. But
well, that was mostly, like I said, notification, because we
yeah,
sent out
outreach.
cards.
Right.
Sent out cards to lots and lots of people.
And we did a survey, and it was more input than going out and doing open houses, and it was less expensive. So I agree, there's online tools.
How many people would you say you get in the online town halls? They have this vision of a couple of hundred people there wanting to say something.
Well, there are two ways to do it. One is a time-defined open house where you're sort of online, like a webinar from 7 to 9. And that's how we did the telephone town halls. People called in at a certain time. They could hear what was being said, and if some of them got to ask questions. And there were people who were just like if you call into KQED's forum, there's someone saying, "What's your question?" And then those worked really well, and we got several hundred people calling in and listening. You can also do them where there's no defined time, where it starts. Well, it's a defined time in the sense that we're going to do it for these 2 months. We're going to do it for October and November of this year. And people can go on any time and they can leave their input. Either could be on a map, it could be, where if you had $100, where would you put your money? Would you put it on a bike lane? Would you put it on new sidewalks? Would you put it on better crossings? Or do you want safe routes to school rather than improvements in a downtown? Those are over longer periods, so you can have more people show up. You still have the question of notifying people that it's happening.
Just one quick note that we are about 10 minutes behind. Not saying this isn't quite worthwhile, and I'm interested in the conversation. Would there be objections to extending the meeting a little bit, 15, 20 minutes? Any? Oh, you have to go. Yeah.
So I'll talk fast.
Yes, talk fast.
On optional
and make important points. Yes.
Important point. Optional task 2.2.7 on page 40. We're talking about the level of traffic stress. I definitely would like to see this included, and I want to suggest that we have Highway 4 between Port Chicago Highway and Willow Pass Road as one of the points that people get to vote on how much stress they get riding on this 8-lane freeway with auxiliary lanes. And I'd also like to suggest as another point, riding on North Main Street in the vicinity of North California Avenue and Walnut Creek as another potentially high-stress area. And so I would definitely like to see optional task 2.2.7 included. And then with optional task 3.8, the telephone town hall, I called, I don't know, it was 2 years ago when Randy and Ross were fielding questions, and it was 7 to 8, and I figured out a question that I wanted to ask about 20 minutes into their official 1-hour-long program, and the computer voice said to me, "You're number 407 in line." And it was going to be cut off in 40 minutes from now. I wasn't ever going to make it, although it was fun listening to other people. I had input that never got inputted.
If you want to share more, you could go online or something. That was the follow-up to it. But I agree, not everyone gets captured.
That is an issue with telephone town halls. I suppose one way you could deal with it is to have questions, that you can put in your questions online, and then the questions could be summarized in a telephone town hall. So people wouldn't directly ask questions, but they would be responded to.
Brad, there's an awful lot here. Is there a chance that we could get a Fair and Fair's rep to speak to the committee, and we could maybe get a little deeper into the various aspects? There's a lot of good stuff, but I'm sure people have a lot of questions too.
Well, I was hoping that we could have one of them come and speak to the committee when we meet in September.
Are you going to be out in September? We're going to reschedule.
Well, I'm going to have to reschedule our meeting.
Okay.
I'm thinking, the 18th? Is that a week before the 25th? Yes.
Sunday.
Is it?
The 19th.
Do the meetings always, is this always on a Monday?
It's always on a Monday, yes. The fourth Monday.
It's my fault. I asked 5 years ago. Said it's done now.
I just would like to comment for the record that I think I'm in favor of a more ongoing survey, online 21st century way of participating, which seems to be what most people are operating under, and possibly one get-together. But I feel like for a plan like this, it needs to be opened up to the public for a little bit longer than just one night at a telephone town hall for an hour. Because, yeah, we all know it's hard to get people's attention, but if they're surprised, they come out in numbers. And then also I wanted to just, for the record, say with local plans, I'm assuming that means regional plans as well, but for the record, I want to make sure that that Fair and Piers is also incorporating the East Bay Regional Park District Master Plan. That's more of a regional plan, so more of a semantics thing, but just for the record. And that's it.
Since it's the date of the last, next meeting is on the agenda as the last item, why don't we just settle that right now? How is the 19th for people? Will that work for 19th of September? It's also a Monday.
I'll have to make sure that there's not a conflict here.
It's not what?
Not a conflict. There might be a conflict with another committee.
So let's set another meeting, maybe a week before that also potentially. If there's a conflict on the 19th, then we'll go a week before.
Can you check on that and get back to us quickly on that, Brad? Or,
Yeah.
yeah.
In fact, that might even work better than we could maybe get some input before the authority takes its action on its final contract.
Okay.
But I think we'll still leave some flexibility in the scope of work.
Can we say we're going to do the 19th unless you check and find out that's not good? And if you would get an email out to us all right away, that would be great.
Yeah, it'll be probably tomorrow.
Great.
So going back to the scope of work, if I could speak in broad general terms, it seems to me that the county's plan should connect the city plans and should indicate how to get across barriers, particularly freeways. Those 2 points I'd like to see emphasized in the plan. Connect the city plans one to another and then get us across barriers.
So considering the time crunch, I will go really quick. Bike East Bay has on our website a blog post about Bike Plans 2.0 and what new generation bike plans can do beyond what previous bike plans have done. And that is really much more looking at implementation plans and having a more holistic perspective on traffic and transportation issues in general. So just quickly, 4 different elements that a good bike plan could include: scientifically accurate public opinion surveys. So reiterating what some people have said, just there's no way we're going to go and get them neighborhood by neighborhood. It needs to be a new widespread way of engaging people. Traffic forecasts based on current average day conditions, not peak 15-minute crunch time moments. Also, just talking about the switch from LOS to VMT. If this is a modern bike plan, let's make sure that it is level of service versus vehicle miles traveled. Also following state policy and guidelines, making sure that the bike plan will be incorporating and helping cities make the switch over from planning using level of service versus planning using vehicle miles traveled. Third one would be parking analysis, including smart parking management and potentially replacement parking options. Just having that included in some way in the plan as one of the ways where bike lanes can be added to streets without doing road diets. Bus service improvements to keep buses on time and moving quickly, and making sure that any bikeway improvements or the creation of a bikeway network also works in tandem with public transportation. Those are the 4, and I can send you a link to the blog.
I can send that out. You send it to me.
Brent, I would also like to see a much more robust section in here regarding the pedestrian usage. I think we talked about it in a very general term. The document talks about estimating future heat demand for pedestrians. I think it would be very beneficial to have maybe a couple of layers in there. For example, to have a map that shows the transit stops, including all of the bus stops throughout the county, and where potentially those pedestrians could actually walk and access the bus stops, including BART. So I think, and not just bus stops, but schools, other regional destinations. I think you mentioned they're going to develop a heat map, and the heat map is good. But then I guess the next question is what happens after the heat map's been developed? I mean, I think there should be maybe a couple of recommendations in here for local jurisdictions, so that way, not just the local jurisdictions, but even for the committee, if we have a heat map showing high pedestrian traffic areas that are outside of traditional downtown areas or commercial corridors, we're able to look at it and say, well, gosh, this is a potentially high pedestrian area where people are walking to a transit stop, because that just helps us inform our decisions down the road. So I don't know if, in addition to, like I said, to the heat map, there's any sort of parameters. I know pedestrians are a little bit more fluid when you talk about demographics, but I think there could be a component in there too. I think the heat maps also need to be weighted. And I know Fair and Piers has done a pretty good job with that in terms of pedestrian heat maps. But I think there needs to be consideration that someone walking to a child walking to a grade school is going to be much different from an adult walking to a transit stop, and so maybe some sort of weighting of not weighting as in terms of WEIGHT, but weight as of what would be a reasonable pedestrian area. I think that could be beneficial.
Well, I think there'll be a lot to discuss in this program, and hopefully with Fair and Piers soon. I think in interest of time, let's move on to the Active Transportation Working Group. Can you sum that up fairly quickly, Brad? No, I don't.
No, I'm not sure I can. There is some work being done on doing more bike ped counts in the region. The MDC is working on. There's a group called the Bay Area Trails Collaborative that's also working with MDC and pushing for a broadening of counts. There's some work on the bike share programs that are going on through the region. MTC has a bike share call for projects. There was a presentation from Cambridge Systematics about a bicycle model that was developed for the Los Angeles Metro. And those are some of the main things that have been discussed the last couple of meetings. There wasn't supposed to be a meeting last week, but it was canceled.
Who goes to ATP? Because Kevin Moldar, used to be Sean Coe. I now get the emails. I didn't used to. But are cities going, or it's just kind of happening?
It's a real mix. Cynthia goes to them. I go to them. I'm actually vice chair. So there, Silicon Valley Bicycle Group. There's a representative. There's jurisdictions. The CMAs have reps. There are some other jurisdictions. I think someone from Oakland usually comes.
Do they have money?
No.
Do they allocate anything?
No.
There's no ATP grant?
No. It's the ATP criteria were discussed and the process, and there were some, and the Active Transportation Working Group did provide input on the criteria used, but they didn't review the end
used
process.
for OBAG?
For the supplemental regional ATP program.
I'm supposed to be bird dogging this, but I'm not following where it goes after that. To the
Well, there's two pots of money. There's a state program, and the state sets certain criteria and
This
application
is the Rails
process.
to Trails did the workshops a while ago when they,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
So there's a state program, and you can apply for that, and it has a set of criteria and an application. There's also regional pot of money. Each region gets a share.
MTC
including
region?
MTC, yes.
Okay.
MTC has to use the same criteria, but they also have some supplemental. They have some supplemental questions that you have to answer. So if you apply for the state one, you automatically get considered for the regional one if you fill out their supplemental questions. And we had a jurisdiction
I vaguely
that didn't
remember
do
this.
that.
Was it federalized money though, and was there a match?
Yes and no.
Okay, there's no match, and yes, it was federal.
Sometimes you can get away with no match.
And yeah, in the ATP funds, it's the biggest pot of bike and ped funding in the state of California. It's an amalgamation of numerous different sources. So there is some federal funding, but there is some that is also just regional, statewide.
And some
It
of
just
them,
doesn't seem to flow the information very.
it's a very complicated program
And it-
because it does have sources from federal.
I know there's a lot
the
of ifs,
OBT
ands, or buts, but where do the cities and the county get this information? I mean, there's sort of, I get emails sometimes, but, you know, it's like one random email does not make an alert.
It should probably come from either MTC or Caltrans.
Okay.
Caltrans is the body that is reviewing all of the state applications.
Yeah. Have cities, Jeremy, have you guys been plugged into this?
I'm sorry, into the ATP.
Yeah.
We've reviewed and submitted, but I wasn't a part of the ATP process
Okay.
in Walnut Creek.
In any case, the call for project is done, and there won't be another one for 2 years. So
I'll
you've
maybe
got
be
plenty of
retired
time to
then
read
now.
up.
And I will tell you, the ATP application is immensely difficult. And there are a lot of jurisdictions that just would never do well on it because what they call disadvantaged communities, or DACs, communities with those do a
West
lot
County.
better, or
Yeah.
with communities concerned.
So didn't you guys apply for one and get overcrossing in San Pablo? Wasn't that ATP money? Or was
Yes.
that OBEG? Maybe,
Yes, it was ATP.
Okay. So, I mean, we're a community of concern out in West County, a lot of it. It's good stuff.
Richmond got a project last year, the Yellow Brick Road project within the Iron
okay.
Triangle. Rumrow Boulevard in San Pablo also is
Great.
funded
I'm
through
glad
the
just to
ATP.
know the cities
So
are on.
the cities are applying.
WIGTech has
and,
not been a good conduit of information, and I think it's probably my fault.
I think there was a Safe Routes to School project in Bay Point that got some funding as
Yeah.
well.
And I think didn't the last round of project call, isn't the money way out there too?
2020, 2021.
Yeah, so the call was just now.
Something that won't be available in 2021?
Yeah.
So a question on this active transportation group. The next meeting is going to be on Beale Street in San Francisco. And the new
Yes.
MTC office.
Yeah, the
guess a
MTC
date
is,
on
yeah,
that?
375 Beale. Mhm.
Oh, yeah. I think I'd go to that meeting. I could ride my bike to Treasure Island. Except
Yeah, the underwater part is tough.
So a guess on the next date, Brad? Every other month, starting in January, so that would be September?
It'll be September I don't have my phone with me.
Okay,
so.
close enough, but
It's
that-
the
third
it's the
Sep-
third
third
it's the
Thursday?
morning of the third Thursday.
Okay. Yeah, cool, good, thanks.
Okay, are there any announcements from people? I hope you all had I'll do a backwards announcement. I hope you all had a chance to go down to Bike Eats Bay's Pedal Fest last weekend, very successful. If not, put it on your calendars for July next year. Any announcements? Yes.
I turned it off. We broke ground on a new roundabout. It's the first roundabout in the city at Pleasant Hill Road and Olympic Boulevard, and it does feature some complete street amenities. So we hope to have that fully implemented by the new year in 2017.
I think we can adjourn it then. Thank you, Brad.